The psychiatrist marked her file as unfit for combat duty after the evaluation. Fellow pilots assumed she'd cracked under pressure. Hours later, when a crisis hit that no textbook had prepared them for, they learned that being unfit sometimes meant being the only one fit enough to handle the impossible. What you're about to witness isn't just another military story. It's the chilling account of how a single psychiatrist's signature nearly caused the deadliest friendly fire incident in Air Force history. Captain Veronica Caldwell had been flying combat missions when most of her colleagues were still learning to drive. She had medals they'd never heard of and combat experience in theaters that didn't officially exist. But in one devastating hour, all of that was stripped away by a man who had never left the safety of his office. What happened next would expose a terrifying truth. Sometimes the people labeled as broken are the only ones capable of saving everyone else. Before we continue this incredible story, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Captain Caldwell, Dr. Griswold began, his voice carrying the detached tone of someone who'd made his decision before the session started. I've reviewed your recent mission reports and conducted today's evaluation. Your responses indicate significant signs of combat stress reaction, commonly known as PTSD. Veronica remained perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She'd faced enemy fire countless times, but this sterile room felt more threatening than any battlefield. Sir, I'd like to understand what specific behaviors or responses led to this conclusion. Dr. Griswold adjusted his glasses and flipped through her file. Your tendency to deviate from standard operating procedures during high-stress situations, your preference for unconventional tactical approaches, and most concerning, your detailed recollection of traumatic events from Operation Desert Storm 15 years ago, which you described with what I consider excessive clarity. Excessive clarity about events that saved 37 lives? Veronica asked quietly. The fact that you remember those events so vividly suggests you haven't properly processed the trauma, Griswold replied, making notes in her file. Combined with reports from fellow pilots about your intense focus during briefings and your reluctance to engage in typical squadron social activities, I'm recommending immediate grounding pending further psychological treatment. Veronica felt something cold settle in her chest. Dr. Griswold, with respect, my intense focus and tactical decisions have resulted in a 100% mission success rate over my career. My reluctance to engage in social activities stems from preferring to study aircraft systems and mission parameters rather than participate in drinking contests. Captain, your defensive response only reinforces my assessment, Griswold said, stamping a red denied across her flight clearance form. You're grounded indefinitely, effective immediately. Please surrender your flight gear to Lieutenant Vance outside. The walk from Dr. Griswold's office to the equipment depot felt like a death march. Word traveled fast on a military base, and Veronica could feel the stares and hear the whispered conversations as she passed groups of pilots and ground crew. She'd been at Meridian for 6 months, transferred in to lead a new tactical training program, but she'd never quite fit in with the existing squadron culture. Lieutenant Garrett Vance, a cocky pilot fresh from flight school, was waiting at the equipment depot with barely concealed satisfaction. Sorry to hear about your situation, Captain, he said, not sounding sorry at all. Guess the pressure finally got to you. Behind him, several other pilots had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to smugness. Captain Brendan Kowalski, who'd been openly resentful of Veronica's leadership position since her arrival, crossed his arms and shook his head. I hate to say I told you so, but some people just aren't cut out for this life. The flight surgeon was probably just being cautious. offered Lieutenant Samantha Reeves, though her tone suggested she was merely going through the motions of politeness. Veronica methodically removed her flight suit, helmet, and gear, handing each item to Vance without comment. The weight of their judgment pressed down on her, but she'd learned long ago that explaining herself to people who'd already made up their minds was pointless. As she signed the final paperwork acknowledging her grounded status, Vance couldn't resist one more dig. "You know, Captain, maybe this is for the best. Combat flying isn't for everyone, especially after, well, whatever happened to you over there." He gestured vaguely, as if her combat experience was some embarrassing secret rather than distinguished service. Veronica looked up at him for the first time since entering the depot. "Lieutenant Vance, how many combat hours do you have logged?" "That's not really relevant." "How many?" Vance shifted uncomfortably. 17 hours, but that's not the point. The point is knowing when you're not fit to fly anymore." Veronica nodded slowly, picked up her personal items, and walked toward the exit. As she reached the door, she paused without turning around. 17 hours, she repeated quietly, then continued out into the desert heat. The remainder of the afternoon passed in surreal quiet. Veronica retreated to her quarters, a sparse room in the bachelor officer quarters that she'd never bothered to decorate. The walls were bare, except for a single photograph of her old squadron from Desert Storm, taken the day after the mission that had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross. 23 faces looked back at her, but 14 of those faces belonged to pilots who hadn't made it home from subsequent missions. She sat on her narrow bunk and opened her laptop, more out of habit than purpose. Her mission analysis reports filled the screen, detailed breakdowns of combat scenarios and tactical recommendations that had been praised by commanders at the Pentagon. Yet, here she was, deemed unfit by a psychiatrist who'd never fired a shot in anger or made a life-or-death decision at 30,000 feet. At 1847 hours, the base alarm system shattered the evening quiet. The distinctive wail of the combat alert klaxon sent personnel scrambling across the base as the announcement crackled over the loudspeakers. "All personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Veronica was on her feet before the announcement finished, muscle memory taking over. She grabbed her tactical vest from her closet, then stopped. She wasn't on active duty anymore. She wasn't supposed to respond to combat alerts, but through her window, she could see ground crews rushing to prepare aircraft while pilots sprinted toward the flight line. The second wave of alarms brought a more specific announcement. Unknown aircraft approaching from the southwest. Multiple bogies, estimated 6 minutes to contact. All available interceptors scramble immediately. Veronica's blood went cold. Southwest approach meant the hostile aircraft were using the same vector she'd encountered 15 years ago during Operation Desert Storm, the engagement that had resulted in her most traumatic combat experience. It was an approach that negated most of the base's early warning systems by hugging the mountainous terrain, emerging only when they were too close for conventional intercept procedures. Her laptop screen still displayed her mission analysis reports, including a detailed study she'd completed just 2 weeks earlier on defensive vulnerabilities at southwestern air bases. She'd identified the exact approach vector now being used and had recommended specific countermeasures that had been filed away pending review by higher command. The building shook as the first fighter jets launched from the runway, their afterburners painting orange streaks across the darkening sky. Veronica counted 4 aircraft, 2 F-16s piloted by Vance and Kowalski, followed by 2 F-15s with Reeves and another pilot she didn't recognize. Standard intercept formation, by-the-book procedures, exactly what any competent pilot would do. It was also exactly the wrong response for this particular threat. Veronica grabbed her radio from the tactical vest and tuned to the combat frequency. The chatter that filled her earpiece confirmed her worst fears. The pilots were following standard intercept protocols, But the hostile aircraft weren't behaving according to standard attack patterns. They were using the terrain masking and electronic countermeasures that Veronica had documented in her reports, tactics that rendered conventional interception nearly impossible. Falcon 2, I'm showing multiple contacts, but I can't get a clean lock. Vance's voice crackled through the static, tension evident despite his attempt to sound calm. Copy that, Falcon 2, switching to manual targeting. That was Kowalski, following procedure that would be useless against an enemy employing the specific electronic warfare techniques Veronica had encountered before. Base Control, this is Falcon Leader, Reeves's voice cut through the chatter. Hostile aircraft they're not showing up on radar consistently. We're getting intermittent contacts, but nothing solid enough for engagement. Veronica closed her eyes and let the familiar weight of tactical analysis settle over her mind. She'd been here before, in circumstances so similar, it felt like a recurring nightmare. The hostile aircraft were using a combination of terrain following, electronic jamming, and what military intelligence called ghost protocols, flying patterns designed to exploit specific weaknesses in radar coverage that most pilots didn't even know existed. The difference was that 15 years ago, Veronica had figured out the countermeasures in real time, under fire, with half her squadron already shot down around her. She'd developed an unconventional response that ignored standard procedures, in favor of tactical creativity born from desperation. It had worked then, saving what remained of her squadron and earning her a medal she'd never wanted. Now, listening to the confusion and growing panic in the voices of pilots who'd dismissed her just hours earlier, she realized that the psychiatrist had been exactly wrong about her condition. Her excessive memory of traumatic events wasn't a psychological disorder, it was a tactical database. Her unconventional approaches weren't signs of instability. They were innovations born from facing situations that conventional wisdom couldn't handle. Falcon Leader, we're taking fire! Vance's voice had lost all pretense of calm. Where the hell are these guys coming from? Multiple missile locks! Multiple missile locks! Kowalski was shouting now, the professional composure cracking under pressure. Veronica stood up, her decision made. She grabbed her flight gear and headed for the door, knowing that technically she was disobeying direct orders by involving herself in combat operations while grounded. But she also knew that in approximately 3 minutes, those 4 aircraft were going to be shot down by an enemy employing tactics that she was probably the only person on the base qualified to counter. The Flight Operations Center was in chaos when Veronica arrived. Ground controllers were trying to coordinate the airborne intercept, while radar operators struggled to maintain contact with the hostile aircraft. Colonel Franklin Morse, the base commander, stood over a tactical display that showed a confusing mess of intermittent contacts and friendly aircraft positions. "Sir," Veronica announced her presence as she entered the room. Colonel Morse looked up, his face registering surprise and irritation. "Captain Caldwell, you're not supposed to be here. You're grounded." "Sir, I've encountered this exact tactical scenario before. The hostile aircraft are using—" "Captain, you're relieved of duty pending psychological evaluation. I need you to return to quarters immediately." The radio crackled with another transmission from the embattled flight. "Base Control, Falcon 3, I'm hit. Repeat, I'm hit. Missile came from nowhere." Colonel Morse's expression shifted from irritation to alarm as he realized the gravity of the situation. On the tactical display, one of the friendly contacts was descending rapidly, leaving a data trail that indicated critical damage. Veronica stepped closer to the display, her trained eye immediately recognizing the pattern emerging from the chaos. "Sir, the hostile aircraft are flying a modified Sarajevo stack formation. It's a tactic designed to exploit blind spots in ground-based radar by using mountainous terrain and synchronized electronic countermeasures. Standard intercept procedures won't work because—" "Captain Caldwell, I told you to return to quarters." Colonel, in approximately 90 seconds, you're going to lose another aircraft unless someone up there understands how to counter this formation. I've done it before. The radio erupted with urgent transmissions as the aerial engagement intensified. Veronica could hear the strain in the pilots' voices as they struggled against an enemy they couldn't consistently track or target. It was exactly the same confusion and desperation she'd heard in her own squadron's communications 15 years ago, just before half of them had been shot down. Falcon Leader, I've lost radar contact with Falcon 4. Reeves's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Colonel Morse stared at the tactical display where another friendly contact had disappeared from the screen. 2 of his 4 interceptors were now either damaged or missing, and the hostile aircraft were continuing their approach toward the base. In his years of command, he'd never faced a situation where standard procedures were proving so utterly inadequate. Veronica watched the colonel's face as the weight of command decisions settled over him. She'd seen that look before, on the faces of commanders who suddenly realized that the enemy wasn't following the script they'd been trained to handle. It was the moment when military leaders had to choose between rigid adherence to protocol and the flexible thinking that actually won battles. Captain Caldwell, Colonel Morse said finally, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Explain what you know about this formation. Veronica moved to the tactical display, her fingers tracing the pattern of hostile aircraft movements across the screen. The Sarajevo stack uses 3 layers of aircraft flying at different altitudes and speeds, synchronized to create overlapping blind spots in radar coverage. The lead aircraft flies terrain-following profile, using mountains to mask approach. The second layer provides electronic countermeasures, jamming targeting systems. The third layer, flying highest, acts as overwatch and strike coordination. How do you counter it? You don't intercept the formation. You break it apart. The electronic warfare layer is the key. They're flying a predictable pattern to maintain jamming effectiveness. If you can force them to break pattern, the whole formation loses cohesion. Colonel Morse looked at the display, then at Veronica, then at the radio as another frantic transmission filled the air. How do you force them to break pattern? Single aircraft approach from below their radar horizon, using terrain masking to avoid detection until you're inside their formation. Then you target the EW aircraft first, forcing the others to reposition defensively. Once the formation breaks apart, standard intercept procedures become effective again. Morse paused, clearly weighing the unconventional nature of the tactic against the desperate situation playing out in real time. That's not in any manual I've ever read. No, sir, it's not. It's something I developed during Operation Desert Storm when my squadron encountered the same formation. The radio crackled again. Base control, this is Falcon 2. I'm Winchester, out of missiles, and I still can't get a clean shot on these guys. Colonel Morse made his decision. Captain Caldwell, can you talk them through this tactic from here? Veronica looked at the tactical display, calculating angles and timing in her head. Sir, with respect, this maneuver requires split-second timing and 3-dimensional tactical awareness that can only be developed through experience. Trying to coach someone through it via radio would likely result in their death. The implication hung in the air between them. Colonel Morse understood what Veronica was suggesting, but she was grounded, officially declared unfit for combat duty. Authorizing her to fly would be a career-ending decision if things went wrong. Falcon Leader, we need immediate assistance. Unknown number of hostiles are breaking through our perimeter. Morse closed his eyes for a moment, weighing the certain failure of conventional approaches against the risk of trusting a pilot his own psychiatrist had declared unfit. When he opened them, his decision was clear. Captain Caldwell, there's an F-22 on the ready line, fueled and armed. How quickly can you be airborne? 3 minutes, sir. Then get out there and save my pilots. Veronica was already moving toward the door as Morse keyed his microphone. All stations, This is base control. Falcon 5 is launching for emergency intercept. Falcon 5 will be operating under special protocols. All aircraft are to follow her lead immediately and without question. Falcon 5, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. The tower controller's voice crackled through her headset as the canopy closed. Roger. Falcon 5 rolling. The Raptor accelerated down the runway with the kind of raw power that pressed Veronica back into her seat and reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. As the aircraft lifted off into the darkening sky, she felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her in combat situations. This was where she belonged, where all the skills and instincts honed over 2 decades of flying coalesced into something approaching perfection. Falcon 5, this is Falcon Leader. Reeves's voice came through the radio, strained but professional. We've lost contact with Falcon 3 and 4. Falcon 2 is Winchester and heading home. I'm down to guns only and can't get a clean shot. Copy, Falcon Leader. Maintain current heading and altitude. I'm going to break their formation, then we'll take them one by one. Veronica banked the F-22 into a steep descent, using the mountainous terrain to mask her approach exactly as she'd done 15 years ago in a different aircraft over different mountains against the same tactical formation. The hostile aircraft appeared on her radar as intermittent contacts, exactly as expected, but their pattern was predictable once you understood the methodology behind it. At 200 feet above the desert floor, flying between rock formations that would have terrified most pilots, Veronica approached the hostile formation from their blind spot. The electronic warfare aircraft was exactly where she'd calculated it would be, flying a racetrack pattern to maintain jamming coverage while staying clear of potential intercept vectors. Falcon 5 has contact, she announced calmly into her radio, breaking formation in 3, 2, 1. The Raptor climbed abruptly, breaking the horizon like a shark breaching the surface. Veronica's targeting system immediately locked onto the electronic warfare aircraft, and she fired a single missile that found its target before the hostile pilot even knew he was being engaged. The explosion lit up the night sky, and immediately the radio chatter changed character. The remaining hostile aircraft, suddenly exposed without their electronic protection, began breaking formation exactly as Veronica had predicted. Falcon Leader, you now have multiple clean contacts bearing 270 through 315. Engage at will. Holy Falcon 5, how did you... Never mind. Falcon Leader engaging. The remainder of the engagement proceeded with textbook efficiency. Without the sophisticated electronic countermeasures that had made them nearly invisible, the hostile aircraft became conventional targets that conventional tactics could handle. Reeves accounted for 2 of them, while Veronica eliminated the remaining bogies with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly how your enemy would react to pressure. Base control, this is Falcon Leader. All hostile aircraft are down. Repeat, all hostiles down. Falcon 5... Reeves's voice paused, searching for words. Falcon 5, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen. Just doing the job, Falcon Leader. Let's head home. The landing approach at Meridian gave Veronica a few minutes to process what had just happened. In the space of less than an hour, she'd gone from being declared unfit for duty to saving what remained of the base's air defense capability. The same tactical instincts and combat memories that Dr. Griswold had pathologized as mental illness had proven to be exactly what was needed when conventional approaches failed. As the F-22 touched down and rolled toward the flight line, Veronica could see vehicles and personnel gathered near the hangars. Word of the engagement had spread quickly through the base, and it seemed like half the installation had turned out to witness her return. Colonel Morse was waiting as she climbed down from the aircraft, his expression unreadable in the floodlights illuminating the flight line. Behind him stood Dr. Griswold, looking significantly less confident than he had during their evaluation session hours earlier. Captain Caldwell, Morse began formally, then stopped and extended his hand. Outstanding work out there. Your tactical innovation saved lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on this installation." Veronica shook his hand, noting that several of the pilots who had witnessed her grounding earlier were now watching with expressions ranging from amazement to embarrassment. Vance and Kowalski, both of whom had returned safely thanks to her intervention, stood slightly apart from the group, clearly struggling with how to process what they had witnessed. "Sir, I was just applying lessons learned from previous combat experience," Veronica replied simply. Dr. Griswold stepped forward, his demeanor notably different from their earlier interaction. "Captain Caldwell, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding in my earlier assessment. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up evaluation to reassess my conclusions." Veronica looked at him steadily. "Dr. Griswold, with respect, I don't think there was any misunderstanding. You evaluated my responses based on textbook criteria without understanding the context that gave those responses their meaning. Combat experience isn't a pathology to be treated. It's a resource to be utilized when circumstances require unconventional solutions." Morse nodded slowly. "Captain, your flight status is hereby restored, effective immediately. Moreover, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion and assignment as Senior Tactical Instructor for this installation. It's clear we have some gaps in our training curriculum that need to be addressed." As the crowd began to disperse and the excitement of the evening settled into routine post-mission procedures, Veronica found herself approached by Lieutenant Reeves, who had led the original intercept flight. "Captain," Reeves began hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. We all do. The way we treated you earlier, the assumptions we made, we were wrong." Veronica considered her response carefully. "Lieutenant, you weren't wrong to have concerns about someone you didn't know or understand, but you were wrong to assume that different meant inferior. Combat experience changes people, but not always in the ways that are obvious or easy to categorize. How do we learn to recognize the difference? You listen more than you judge. You ask questions instead of making assumptions. And you remember that the people who've been through the worst situations often have the most valuable insights for handling new challenges." Later that evening, alone in her quarters, Veronica sat at her laptop and opened a new document. Her first assignment as Senior Tactical Instructor would be developing a curriculum that taught not just conventional procedures, but adaptive thinking and tactical innovation. She would ensure that future pilots understood the difference between following rules and solving problems. The photograph of her old squadron still looked down from the wall, 14 faces representing lessons learned at too high a cost. But tonight, those lessons had saved lives and prevented a catastrophe. The memories that Dr. Griswold had labeled as traumatic damage were actually Veronica's most valuable professional assets. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Saw the news report about tonight's engagement. Knew you still had it in you. Stay dangerous. Colonel Hutchinson, Reti." Veronica smiled, recognizing the name of her old squadron commander from Desert Storm. Apparently, word traveled fast in the aviation community. She typed back, "Some lessons stick better than others. Thanks for teaching them right the first time." As she prepared for sleep, Veronica reflected on the day's strange journey from disgrace to vindication. She'd learned something important about the difference between fitting in and being valuable, between conforming to expectations and serving a greater purpose. The military, like any large organization, sometimes struggled to distinguish between different and dangerous, between unconventional and unstable. But when crisis struck and conventional wisdom proved inadequate, those same differences became assets. The experiences that made her an outsider in peacetime made her invaluable in combat. The memories that were labeled as traumatic were actually a tactical database that no classroom could replicate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students who needed to learn not just how to fly, but how to think. Veronica would teach them that being a warrior wasn't about following scripts. It was about writing new ones when the old ones failed. The base settled into quiet as the desert night deepened around Meridian Air Force Base. In the distance, the runway lights twinkled like a constellation against the dark landscape, ready for whatever threats tomorrow might bring. And in her quarters, a pilot who had been declared unfit for duty closed her eyes and dreamed of clear skies and perfect formation flying, knowing that sometimes the most broken people were actually the most complete.